are joined by writer director of Censor, Prano Bailey-Bond. Welcome.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you for coming to hang out with us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
First off, before I ask you any questions, I have to say congratulations. Like,
Thank you.
I love this movie so much, and I've heard like people are just raving about it coming out of festivals, and people that have gotten to watch it like streaming and such. But this 100% lives up to the hype. Like, checked all of my boxes. I was so excited watching this.
Oh, that's so nice. That's always lovely to hear. Thanks.
Oh yeah, awesome. So tell us what it's about.
So, Censor is a psychological horror film set during the 80s in the UK against the backdrop of social hysteria surrounding video nasties or VHS horror. And it follows a female film censor called Enid Baines, who's played by the amazing Neve Algar. And one day at work, she sees a film which takes her back to the day that her sister disappeared when she was a child. And she decides to investigate the film's director. And when she does that, she goes on this journey that kind of blurs the line between fiction and reality.
That was beautiful and concise.
I've obviously never said that before
That was right off the cuff. That was just totally improvised.
on the spot.
Yeah, there's so many things that I'm like, I don't want to summarize this because I feel like anything I say gives things away, you know?
Yeah.
But, um, so, I mean, I grew up in America, partially in the 80s, mostly in the 90s. I'm aware of video nasties as a concept, but it was obviously as a film fan, particularly as a horror fan, but it was more of like in the abstract. So this was kind of a cool way to put a face to it because I always have thought of it as like video nasties, kind of like the bad guys, for lack of a better term, the censors, you know, kind of like shitting on the stuff that we love. So this was
Yeah.
kind of interesting to then, I mean, I felt for Enid. I liked her. So that was kind of an interesting way to put a face and kind of like, why are you the way that you are? And then you answered that question in this story.
But I mean, I was thinking that when I was writing the film, because obviously you're thinking about your audience and you're thinking about, over here, the cult, horror fans who were alive in this during this period and they were adults and they were having their houses raided because of the kind of panic around these films. Um, and how are they going to respond to a film censor being the central character? Because that's the enemy. But I think that's a really interesting place to create because you're putting yourself into the mind of the person on the other side and trying to understand that and explore that. And also it gave me like room to explore our relationship with horror, through a slightly different lens, I think. That was really fun for me as somebody who loves watching and making horror and always gets asked why horror, and you're like, well, yeah, why horror? Like, why do I love this stuff? So yeah, it was really fun, and I hadn't seen a film censor as a central character in anything when I kind of thought of this, and I haven't really seen film censors be at the heart of stories very much at all.
Right. And especially not in a way where you feel for them or empathize with them. And it's very much humanized it, you know what I mean? As far as it's this faceless entity just censors, you know?
Yeah.
And then we have a face and we have a character that we care about, and then we come to understand things about her past that maybe have motivated her decisions in life.
Yeah, exactly. And that was always something that me and my co-writer Anthony Fletcher were thinking about, like, why has she become a censor? What's led her to this point? And for all of the characters, that are censors in the film, everybody had their reasons for coming to that role, and in the same way as when I spoke to film censors who worked during the period, they all came to it because of their different backgrounds or the things that they could bring to the role. So it may have been something as simple as they could speak another language and they needed people to be able to watch films in other languages, or perhaps somebody had a background in psychology and they had worked with women in refuges and they wanted someone to look at the violence towards women aspect and things. But for Enid, it was very much that she's trying to make up for the fact that she hasn't protected her little sister as a child. And so, at one point she says to her mum, I do it to protect people. And I remember reading a quote, a Cronenberg quote, that was something along the lines of, the film censor who's out to protect is the most dangerous censor of all. And I loved that quote when I was writing the film, because I thought, well, he knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah. That's awesome. So you had to actually like interview or sit down and talk with people who worked as censors while you were working on the script?
Yeah. And we also talked to the BBFC, the people that work there now as well. So we were first off speaking to the kind of current BBFC, and they're actually called compliance officers now, which is less catchy, I think.
Yeah.
They were really helpful. We didn't know how they were going to react, and they were like, yes, come in and have a chat, and we'll talk to you about how we work, and we'll talk to you about what we know about the period. And then
They're
we
pretty
looked through,
compliant.
yeah, they were very compliant. And they also gave us access to some of the films, the notes from the films from the period, so we were able to go through the files for films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Possession and I Spit on Your Grave and stuff. That was really fascinating. But then I got in touch with a couple of different censors who'd worked during the period. One of them was a woman called Carol Topolsky, who is actually in quite a few documentaries and things about this era. And she wasn't just helpful in the writing process, but she also was kind enough to speak to Neve, before we shot the film. So I put her and Neve in touch so that Neve could kind of speak to somebody firsthand about the job and get a sense of like what it was like day to day being in that role. And Carol would talk about how they'd watch the films both objectively and subjectively, and that they're always thinking, well, how am I reacting to this, and how might someone else react to this? And I don't know, it's so interesting, all of that stuff. I mean, you can get lost in the research for a film like this, because personally I find it fascinating.
Yeah, like as you're telling me this, I can just like feel myself like nerding out over it. I'm like, that's so crazy. Like you got to see the actual notes of like just
Yeah.
I don't know, just like thinking about like somebody watching like Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the very first time and just being like, what the fuck, and getting to see their notes on that. And not just someone watching it for the first time as a fan, but someone who's watching it objectively and
Yeah,
subjectively.
they were, yeah, exactly. And they were really highly educated, intellectual people who are analyzing these films with a very specific eye, and like writing about them in a really intelligent way. And some of them, like I recently went through the file, or not the file, the notes that I'd taken on the Possession file. And, that had like clashing opinions about this film. There was some people who said it was thoroughly boring and just hated everything and thought it was complete trash. And then someone else who said, dissertations could be written about this because it's so rich and there's so much to understand, and that they defend the film's integrity. And obviously that person lost the argument because, it ended up being on the video nasty list. So, which is really fascinating in itself, because that film went to Cannes. I think all of those files had different little treats in them. But it was so interesting to be able to kind of see the different personalities starting to come through, and the different sort of subjectivity that they would bring to a film. And if you just think it's a bad film, that's not really a reason to ban it. But that was sometimes their argument, like, I think this is a bad film and it's super violent, therefore it doesn't have a place in the world. Whereas somebody else might be arguing, but can't you see the depth, etc., etc. But they're losing the argument.
I'm just so like wildly fascinated by all of that. Like I could talk about that. You could write a book on that. Yeah, like a whole thing just on that. Very cool. And you actually showed like the how you're talking about the kind of clashing of opinions. I really enjoyed that you showed that in the movie with the characters that work with Enid. They're not all just kind of like, I call her Little Miss Perfect. They're not all on that same across the board in agreement with things. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to hear those arguments as well.
Yeah, and we kind of saw each censor as being, an opportunity to have a different angle on it, because one of the things that the censors who did work there during the period said to me was they would argue, they were brought in to have an opinion, and be honest about that opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'd get into arguments about films and have to like show the film then to a wider group of examiners and then have a bigger discussion around it. And I guess, you know, you have different characters like Anne, who's Enid's only sort of female colleague, who's very much coming at it from like a social aspect and like thinking about society and caring about society. So I always imagined she'd come from like a social work background. And then you've got Perkins, who says he's from a psychotherapy background, and then Sanderson, who's incredibly pompous from an academic background, but actually says a few things in the film that I agree with, you know. So it was fun kind of crafting those characters out of the different viewpoints that there were during the period, and trying to make them all feel unique and separate and different, you know.
Yeah, and that really speaks to your guys' writing because I feel like it would have been really easy to kind of make those characters kind of just in the background and kind of blend into like a faceless kind of like entity again, you know, but they all had such unique kind of personalities, and that was really fascinating to hear their arguments on why they felt differently about watching the same thing, because that's real, like that's
Yeah.
reality, like we all look at something and we get something completely different from it.
Yeah, and I think that the fact, like you're saying, the censors have been this sort of faceless entity to us all for such a long time. Like behind these walls, there are people making decisions on what we can and can't watch, but they're actually individuals. They're all people that the more I met film censors, the more I realized that they actually love film. You know, most of them have to love film because you couldn't do this job if you didn't love film. You'd be in hell, wouldn't you? And they're very smart people, you know. They're not stupid people at all. And you know, some of the conversations I've had even more recently with film censors have been really eye-opening in terms of the way that they might surprise you in their opinions about things. So yeah, you kind of want to reflect that, but then also I have to, you know, you have to kind of cast the right people then in the role. And the cast were, you know, over there in the States, you might not recognize some of the actors because they're not as well known over there. But over here, some of the actors are like very well known and really, you know, highly thought of actors. So to get those people in these kind of smaller roles, you know, that's a gift because then you can actually bring the character to life in the best way possible.
I love that. So we're like censors, was that kind of, because I said for me it was kind of abstract. Like I was very aware of it, I've learned about it, but it is not a concrete kind of thing for me. So going into this before you started your research, was that kind of an abstract for you as well, or more concrete? And did you also like, did it change your opinion at all after meeting with these people?
I'd seen some, like there was a censor who ended up being really helpful and actually ended up being one of the film censors who watched Censor and rated it over here. Seen him in Q&As at like Fright Fest and stuff, like on panels. So I'd kind of already seen like, oh, he's a film censor and he's at horror festival, you know, on a panel with like Toby Hooper and stuff like that. And you're like, well, this is interesting and not what you'd expect. So I guess like over time, yeah, they start to become real people to you, and you realize that they are people who love the genre as well. So I don't know. It's hard to think back that far as well because it's quite a long time ago. But or started thinking about the film.
Yeah. Okay, you're like, I don't remember anything before that now.
Yeah.
It's 10
Right.
lifetimes ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also love I guess I kind of, it's like a double-edged sword, I guess. Like the scene with like the kind of going into a video rental store and you're trying to get like these like banned VHS tapes that are on the black market. I don't know. I'm like, I kind of wish like I could have experienced some form of that. Like something about that is kind of very cool and just, I guess because it's so foreign to me. Like I've never got to experience that. We have everything kind of like instantly available. So the thought of having to go like back alley channels to get like a movie is kind of like, huh, that's kind of interesting.
It is, and it's also so insane, and we can see that now
Yeah.
because we have the benefit of hindsight. We can objectively look back at this period and be like, oh my God, like, you know, these films were were getting people into so much trouble. You know, those video shops were being raided, those people were being arrested. And you look back at the news, I remember watching this like documentary from the period about, you know, what was going on around video nasties. And I think it was like a newsreel, actually, maybe not a documentary, but they interviewed a video shop owner, and he looks terrified. You know, he's like wide-eyed, he might as well be sweating, this kind of like, you know, oh no, these films are, you know, really terrible, and I'd never have any, you know. And you think, my God, people were really scared because they were going to prison. You know, I think it was Nightmare and a Damaged Brain, the distributor of that film went to prison because they refused to cut even a second out of the film. And I'm like, can you imagine, like, I'm sure maybe, you know, Magnolia amazing, maybe they'd go to prison for censor. You know, it's just such a crazy thing to think of now, a distributor going to jail in the UK, you know, for a horror film. It's bonkers. But that was actually happening. And like, again, you've got Richard Glover, who plays the video shop owner there, who's just such a sort of effortless performer. Like, he was so wonderful to work with. And just embodying that totally terrified guy, because he's thinking, she doesn't look like your average horror fan. Is this a setup? You know, am I gonna give her a copy of, you know, this kind of under the counter video, and then the police are going to charge in and arrest me? So that's a real fear. You know, it was a real thing going on, and it's mental.
It is such a wild concept, especially because, like, okay, you're retelling this story and it's like, oh, that must have been like so long ago. But in reality, it wasn't all that long ago for that kind of stuff. For people to be going prison for making a movie, it's like, oh, that must have been like, you know, a million years ago. And it's like relatively contemporary still.
Yeah, exactly. It's bonkers.
And also, I like to say that I'm like, oh, that would have been cool to seek out this, like, you know, forbidden stuff. There's no fucking way. I would have been too much of a wuss to go in and ask.
Well, there were people that were going over and, like, you know, bringing back copies of illegal horror films, you know, and like copying them for horror fans and sending them around the country and stuff like that. So you've got like these, I don't know, the Robin Hoods of VHS horror going out to like find the treasure and then make sure everybody has a little bit of it. And it was just mad. But I think off the back of that, you've got a community in the UK of horror fans who came together and like grew out of this sort of oppression and being demonized, which obviously is not a positive thing at all. But I think out of those moments, you have something kind of quite beautiful that can form. You know, I had the same thing growing up in Wales, you know, with like rave music in the 90s. Like, it was demonized. And so what you have is like lots of people who like listening to this music going and having like amazing illegal raves by a lake in the woods, you know. And it's the same thing. Like, that's how underground communities sort of are created, I think, out of people disapproving and banning what you love, and you saying, well, I don't care because there's nothing wrong with it, and going ahead and doing it anyway.
I love that. Also, a magical rave by the lake. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
No, but you're right. It is kind of it's definitely a negative thing, but it's the silver lining in a very negative kind of situation. Like, this entire community is being shunned and saying like, no, what you like is bad, or you're bad for liking these things. And then these people coming together who are not bad at all, and just kind of finding that sense of community and a sense of belonging, which is the cool silver lining and what's cool about the horror community in general, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
Love that. Let's see. I think. Oh, we're at 20 minutes. Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
Okay, cool. No, I mean, whatever you want to know. I'm just here to answer questions. No, I'm just really lovely to speak to you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm honestly like I'm such a fan of this movie. It's one of my favorite things that I've seen this year. So I was very excited to finally get to watch it. And not only that, but it lived up and beyond to like all the wonderful things I've heard about it. So seriously, congratulations. And I'm
Thank
excited
you
for
so
just
much.
everyone to buy it on Blu-ray and watch it and see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Amazing.
Censor is now streaming and you can get it on DVD and Blu-ray September 14th. So go get it.